All right. So I really appreciate this quote from Leonard Bernstein: to achieve great things, two things are needed: a plan and not quite enough time, which is exactly what I have today and what my participants experienced when they were teaching as part of this study. So I wanted to lay some foundational information that we in the math ed research community are familiar with that sort of preempted the study. We know that IRE is a very prevalent and problematic discourse practice. IRE stands for initiate, respond, evaluate. And it's when a teacher, let's say me, would initiate a question: "Hey, Ralph, how's Brittany doing in this presentation?" And Ralph, as the student, would respond, there's the R, he would say, "She's doing great." And then the teacher would evaluate. So I would say, yes, she is, you're correct. And that has been found to be the most common discourse practice and happen up to 70% of dialogue in classrooms. And it's problematic because it positions the teacher as the questioner and the evaluator. So it really centers the teacher as the knower. It's also found to go really quickly and really stick to low-level questions. And there's a push in the field of mathematics education to have students and teachers engaging in much richer and higher level thinking than that. We have several decades of research that indicates and shows that lesson planning is very challenging, in particular for early career and pre-service teachers. Similar, we have lots of data that shows that teachers can change their practices with support, but that takes lots of help and time. As we as humans, have any of us tried to change anything, we know that it's difficult but possible. There's also a body of research around mathematics teacher noticing, and that focuses on how math teachers observe, make sense of, and then make decisions for how they're going to respond in the classroom. That is similar to the lesson planning research, which indicates that early career and pre-service teachers struggle with it, and they focus on different things than more senior and in-service and veteran teachers do. What we don't know a ton about is the response or the relationship between lesson planning and response to students. And so that's where this research comes in. Broadly, the purpose of this study is to better understand ways in which pre-service teachers plan for student thinking and how that planning impacts the PST's responses to errors and uncertainties in enacted mathematics lessons. That's a lot of words. I'm going to take you through phrase by phrase. So I am using Lampert's explanation of practice, strategy, and technique to frame this. And by practices, I mean habits or routines that teachers engage in. Those are made up of strategies, which is the how of how pre-service teachers meet learning goals. And then the techniques are the actual enacted behavior. So for example, one example of a practice is to elicit student thinking. And two strategies that a teacher might use are to elicit an answer or ask for clarification. And then two techniques to elicit an answer might be to use a think, pair, share, or directly call on a student. I am also talking about error and uncertainty. And I mean, errors are things that students make mistakes on, get wrong, have incorrect. And uncertainty are statements, questions, or behaviors that indicate students are in the process of learning. And I don't intend for either of these to be negative, although I think culturally we have negative associations with these ideas, but that they are a part of the learning process and will happen for everybody and all of the times that they try to learn something new. I also don't distinguish between the two of these because I think they are very similar constructs, and just the way they present may look different, but I think they are actually very, very similar, if not the same thing. So my boiled down three main research questions for the study are: how do pre-service teachers anticipate student thinking and lesson planning? What role do error and uncertainties play in enacted lessons? And what is the relationship between student thinking and lesson plans and errors and uncertainty responses in enacted lessons? To frame this work, I'm drawing on Remelard's curriculum mapping framework, in which she explained that teachers make decisions about materials in the design arena, and then they enact those in the construction arena. I'm using this a little bit differently than how she did, but very similar to how Morris and Hebert did in 2017, where my design arena is the planning and my construction arena is the responses. So I want to talk to you about the people in this study because it gets a little tricky. My participants were 5 pre-service teachers, PSTs. They were all 4th years or seniors, undergraduate students in a large Midwestern university. And for confidentiality, that is all I will say. Perhaps you could draw some conclusions about where those students were enrolled. And they were all part of a teacher preparation program and on the path to becoming middle school and high school math teachers. In the fall, they taught students, and the students they taught were university undergraduate students. And their teachers, the PST's teachers, were methods instructors, so university faculty and graduate student TAs. So we've got multiple layers of students and teachers, but I'm calling my participants PSTs or pre-service teachers. In the spring, the pre-service teachers taught middle school and high school students and were supported by mentor teachers, which were the middle school and high school math teachers that the students had. And they were also supported by their university methods instructors. Here's a picture that lays out all of the data that I used for the study. The PSTs taught in the fall semester in pairs, and I did not include their very first teaching because it was a short lesson. They just did a number talk, and number talks are awesome, but they didn't reflect the whole lesson. In September and October, the PSTs planned in pairs, taught in pairs, and then reflected individually. And when they taught, they wore individual lapel mics, so their audio is unique. And they did a similar procedure where they planned in pairs, taught in pairs with individual lapel mics, and reflected individually in November and December. I recruited at the end of that semester, so when they gave me permission to use their plans and teaching, that was retroactive, that I just went and got with their permission. In the spring, I interviewed them all individually in January. And then in March, they planned and taught in pairs, but I also interviewed them individually before they taught their lesson. And then for that lesson, I was in the classroom recording and taking notes. And then I interviewed them after the lesson about it. And that was an individual interview. And then that same interview, lesson planning, teaching when I was in the room, and interview after happened in April, and those were individually taught and planned lessons. And then at the end, I interviewed them all individually, sort of a summary experience. This resulted in 10 reflections, 16 lesson plans, 20 enacted lessons, and 30 interviews, which I just put out there because at first, when I only had 5 people participate, I was a little concerned that I wouldn't have enough data, but I ended up having plenty of data to work with. I also had just the most amazing participants. These are their pseudonyms, not their real names. I worked with Carson, who is a white male, Rowan, who is a white male, Taylor, who is a white female, Reed, who is a white female, and Leon, who is a Chinese female. I'm not going to be sharing data from them in this talk just for time, but I just needed to identify. I worked with just amazing people. They were so kind and dedicated and supportive of me, and just so immersed in their learning as early career teachers. They were just amazing. So I did all this. I have all this data. What did I learn? What did we find? So when I looked at their lesson plans, I found that there was a breakdown in the way that they were talking and planning about student thinking. And some of their student thinking were things they were expecting the students to do. And some of the thinking was things that they wanted the students to do. And that was about a 44, 56% breakdown. Expected student thinking was, I think students are going to answer 15 on this, or I think students are going to have trouble simplifying these expressions, versus goal statements were want students to be able to know how to simplify expressions by the end of this lesson. I think this data is influenced by a couple of things. One, the lesson planning template that they used was a very robust one and really focused on what are your goals. So I think the reason that there are 56% of their student thinking was about goals was because of the lesson planning template that they were using that was encouraging them to articulate that many ways and times. On the flip side, I think the expected number is lower or percentage because they really struggled to anticipate student thinking. And that is a theme that comes up in various different data throughout. I think if I followed these pre-service teachers or others or in their first couple of years of teaching and then later, I would imagine this breakdown would shift to having a larger percentage of expected student thinking and less goal as they learned how to better predict student thinking. I also looked at the level of the student thinking that they were planning and found that 64% of their planned student thinking was low level or instrumental using Skemp's instrumental and relational model. So about 2/3 of all of their thinking was procedural and factual. I think students are going to say this, they're going to do this, then this, then this, then this. Just very computational view of mathematics. Versus the 36% of the time when it was higher level, conceptual connections, justifications and representation. And this really surprised me, given the robustness of the lesson planning template that they used. I really thought that this would have been switched and it would have really had a lot more higher level thinking predicted. I also asked about and looked into what resources they used for planning. And there's a whole lot here. And if it looks a little bit like the Tower of Hanoi, that's great. That was sort of the model for this. When the pre-service teachers were planning for students' activities and what they were going to do, that came up 98 different times, and they mentioned 12 different resources. However, when I was asking them or having them focus on what supports they use to anticipate student thinking, they only mentioned that a total of 9 times, and they relied heavily on their mentor teacher in the K-12 classroom, and then their methods instructors, the lesson planning template, rehearsing or practicing on their methods courses, and their methods colleagues, peers. So that tells us a little bit about where these pre-service teachers are going when they're thinking about student thinking and needing help with that. I also looked at their discourse, so what they said, and I looked at it by what they planned to say and then what they actually said. So when they planned for discourse, they planned to use low-level or instrumental moves 41% of the time, and they plan to use high-level or relational moves 43% of the time. That leaves 16%, which I'm calling a contextual or getting ideas out there. How did you get that? Can you explain that to us? Which may have led to either low or high-level thinking. So then when they actually taught these lessons, 50% of their moves were low-level, 30% were contextual, and 20% were high-level. So interesting that both the low level and the contextual increased and the high level decreased. And I think that speaks to how difficult teaching is and how difficult it is to maintain high level thinking, which I'll talk about in just a moment. A subset of the total enacted moves are their responses to errors and uncertainty. And when I looked at just those, 58% of those were low level. So that increased a little bit from the overall discourse that was enacted, but a little bit less, 23% was contextual. What I think is super wonderful in this data set is that the high level moves stayed about the same. So even when PSTs were helping students through errors and uncertainty, they were still using about the same percentage of high-level moves, and I think that's really promising. When I was looking at the relationship between planning and responding, there were some really clear themes that emerged across all of the PSTs. And the sort of biggie one was maintaining the cognitive demand. These pre-service teachers are in a really high quality teacher preparation program where they're learning to create tasks that are challenging for students and encourage students to engage in those tasks in challenging ways. And so they struggled to keep that challenge high throughout the lesson, in particular when students had errors and uncertainty. That's a theme that we see in the literature. That's certainly a theme that I've seen in other math ed-based dissertation defenses that I've attended over the last couple of years. And so it's not unique to these PSTs. They struggled with their time estimation of their class. And at first, I didn't think this was going to play a real big role because it felt more like a classroom management type situation. However, a lot of their lesson plans included them planning to do the synthesis and the connections and the wrapping things up at the end of the lesson. So when things took longer, which is usually how the estimation was off, they ran out of time at the end. And so things got cut off or rushed. And so that's where that's part of where the cognitive demand struggled and related to the next thing, which was the purpose of the lesson. So even though the lesson planning template that they were using encouraged them to write down and identify what the goals were of the lesson were, they all talked about how challenging that was to sort of embody and enact. So yes, I can fill it out on this paper, but what does it actually mean when I'm teaching? And they articulated very nicely and very clearly when they were able to keep that in mind, it really helped them make decisions about what to focus on or what not to focus on. But when they didn't have that in mind or hadn't shared it with students, it made things a lot more difficult. When they were unable to anticipate thinking, they then had to rely on their in-the-moment decisions. And they all talked about how stressful that was, how much it flubbed them up, how much they didn't want their body language to send messages to the students that the question was bad or wrong, and how important it was for them to try to anticipate things, but that there will always be things that they would likely not consider. Related to that, they all experienced forgetting lesson plans, and I know we have a lot of educators in this room, so they are certainly not unique in that experience either, but they talked about, I was really nervous and I didn't remember to do this, and sort of broader issue of needing to adapt lesson plans based on what happens in the classroom, even if it's not for a lack of forgetting, just because humans are a complex species and anticipating what each other does is difficult, even if you're planning for D&D. So I've given you some really specific data, but I wanted to sort of zoom out more broadly to readdress the research question. So in response to how pre-service teachers anticipate student thinking and lesson planning, one, they do, which is great. I remember Ralph and I very early in this had a brief conversation of like, what if they don't anticipate anything, which would have been a finding, but they do. And the template and the support that they get from the methods experiences really impact the way that they're anticipating, but it's still hard. So even though they're using a robust lesson plan and getting really high quality teacher preparation methods support, they still struggled to anticipate thinking, and the level of thinking that they anticipated was most often low. When it comes to what roles error and uncertainty play in lessons, lots. There was about 20 instances of error and uncertainty in every lesson on average. And the purpose of the lesson and the activities that the students engaged in really impacts the way that error and uncertainty play a role. So sometimes those lessons were, here's a worksheet, do all these factual questions. Well, that really sets a tone of the type of things that students are going to ask about and the types of responses that pre-service teachers are going to give, compared to if students are working on a conceptual based question or an open-ended question and run into error and uncertainty and what discourse happens around those instances. I also saw the PST's teaching philosophy and their ideas about learning and the education they were receiving play into this, as they would reference things that were happening in their methods courses. And the relationship between student thinking and lesson plans and enacted lessons, like all relationships, is complicated. But I think the main theme there is that lesson planning is challenging, and therefore enacting those lesson plans is extra challenging because they don't go according to plan. And that there was still a lot that the PSTs didn't anticipate, which meant that they were relying on their in their moment thinking, and that is likely to be different than if they had been able to rely on planned thinking. So I want to sort of launch us into the world with two final things. From the literature, we know that IRE is a very common discourse pattern and happens upwards of 70% of the time in classrooms. However, in this study, IRE was the case in about 40% of the discourse and the dialogue in the classroom. So I think it's pretty amazing that a group of very, very early career teachers, pre-service teachers, were able to only rely on IRE 40% of the time. I think that's a huge win, as they will inevitably be able to build upon what they're doing now and making that even richer as they move forward. Another piece that I want to kind of say is where I think I would like this work or my work to go, but not in the next couple months, is this idea of intellectual empathy, which may not be exactly the right term. But by this, I mean a skill of understanding someone else's thinking on an intellectual level while considering their humanity and emotions. And in my actual paper, I refer to this as an ability, and I need to tweak that to skill because I believe these are skills that we can learn. So on one hand, there's an empathy, self-compassion type knowledge and practice. And on the other hand, there's the pedagogical content knowledge, the PCK, the MKT, mathematical knowledge for teaching, or the technological pedagogical content knowledge, TPAC. And I think there's sort of a place in the middle of when teachers can draw from both of those. So I can understand your emotions and humanity, and I can also understand your thinking. And I feel like there's a place where those mesh. And the PSTs in this study talked a couple of times about how they were just really surprised when students had particular answers because the PSTs had just never thought about things that way before. And I think this is where that fits in. So potential future work, any of you who are in academia who want to join me on that, let me know like in a month or so. So thank you. I am just feeling so loved by having so many people here and good wishes and texts and all of this stuff. So it has been quite the team effort, particularly for the guy who's sitting in our bedroom right now, who's been above and beyond on parenting stuff in these last few months to help me get through this. So thank you, everybody.